they're enjoying themselves too much on the airfield. Get all that aircrew up here to come and observe this from 5 miles away. 5 miles away from an atom bomb? You've got to be joking. No. And to this day, Ian, I can still see the skeleton of my fingers through that flash, when that flash went off. Absolutely incredible. You wouldn't have believed it.
This is Cold War Conversations.
Thanks to Patron Simon Smith for today's intro. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Squadron leader John Robinson was an RAF pilot who was tasked to fly into the mushroom clouds of nuclear tests to capture samples at Operation Buffalo at Maralinga in 1956 and Operation Grapple at Christmas Island in 1957. He tells of his recruitment into the RAF, initial training and his cloud sampling missions, as well as his experiences of watching the tests from as little as 5 miles away. It is reckoned that over 22,000 British servicemen participated in British and American nuclear tests and cleanups between 1952 and 1965, along with scientists from the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment and civilians. The majority of men have passed away and only around a tenth of them remain. I was honoured that the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association invited me to their annual reunion and enabled me to capture some of their veteran stories. Now, I could really use your help to support my work and enable me to continue producing the podcast. If you become a monthly supporter, you will get the sought-after Cold War Conversations coaster as a thank you and bask in the warm glow of knowing that you're helping to preserve Cold War history. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. If a financial contribution is not your cup of tea, then you can still help us by leaving written reviews wherever you listen to us, as well as sharing us on social media. So, back to today's episode. I'm delighted to welcome John Robinson to our Cold War conversation.
Went into father's business for a short while, and then I discovered that by this time he had a dairy business running in the what we've called the Dengie 100, and he had me organised to run the milk run. Then I discovered I was delivering bottles of milk for 365 days a year, and that didn't appeal at all. So, I knew I was going to have to do national service, so I thought, well, what can I make out of that? I'd like to go flying if possible. Well, it wasn't in those days possible to become, well, it was, but very, very rarely a national service pilot. So I thought, right, what's the easiest way out? I'll go for a short service commission in the Royal Air Force, and that might get me straight in. And sure enough, I passed the acceptance tests at Hornchurch, the Aircrew Selection Centre there. They said, start when you like. Well, I was only just turned 18 when I started at Cardington in the Royal Air Force, and that was the initial thing before we got sent off to Cranwell in initial training school at Cranwell, not the college, and that's how all the training started in a quick way. So by the end of the summer of '52, I was ready to go on to pilot training. Yeah.
Right. Right. What aircraft were you trained on?
Right. Well, the next move was straight away. There was no rest from the end of the initial training school course to the flying training school course, which was done in Feltwell, up in Norfolk, just on the edge of Norfolk. And we started on Prentices, Percival Prentice, and then the dear old North American Harvard 2B, which they were the two aeroplanes they had there. A grass airfield. I'd never ever flown before. I'd never been in an aeroplane before. I haven't a clue what I was going to expect. And this sort of burly instructor gets in beside me and they said, "Oh, okay, Robinson, put your chute on." Nobody had shown me how to put a parachute on for a starter.
You'd think that would be lesson one, wouldn't you?
Well, so I got over that and a bit nervous by this time. He was starting to wind me up a little bit. But anyway, off we launched in this apprentice, which is a lumber, to say the least. Everything is done at 70 knots in the apprentice. It takes off at 70 knots, it climbs at 70 knots, it cruises not much faster, and then it descends and lands about that speed. So that was it. It wasn't an easy aeroplane to fly. Aerobatics were just a non-starter.
And were you a natural pilot, would you say?
I would say it came very easily to me, yes. And I think that's why I tended to go along with the flow of people and watch some of my colleagues struggling. I thought, well, what are you struggling about? That seemed very easy to me. And I found that easy. If my instructor gave me a good demonstration of what something was on, then I could do it straight away. And he especially when we went on to the Harvard, where we were going to do proper aerobatics and loops and barrels and all sorts of things. And I had a good instructor there who suddenly said, I've got a candidate here who can probably do the job without too much problem. And I was agreeably surprised because I came away with, I think, with an above the average assessment. So I couldn't have been that bad. Halfway through that course, we lost half our course. All of a sudden, the Korean War was no longer a requirement. And I was obviously in the top half of grades and things. And they kept me on, and I think I wound up third or second in the course. And I was very pleased with what we are. We only started with 30 of us, 4 of those of which were Burmese, and being trained with us. So we didn't wind up with very many of us getting our wings on, I think it was June the 2nd or something like that, in 1953.
Right.
Yeah.
And where was your first operational posting?
Well, we went on. Then I had to do a jet conversion. And that was on Meteors, Meteor 7s and Meteor F4s, down at Western Zoyland in Somerset. And that was a quick 6 months whiz through there. And then they said, okay, young man, well, you're a bit of a tearaway. You might think you're going on to fighters, but no, you're going on to bombers, onto bomber command. So I said, okay, I had to accept what I was given. But at that time, of course, the Canberra was the new shiny vehicle that the RAF had got, or aircraft that the Air Force had got. And it was second to none, as we all know in the world, and how well it did ultimately do. The Americans built it, and I believe they're still flying one.
NASA, I think, are still flying them because there's nothing like it.
Yeah, that's right. And this was another point later on that we often found that we were having to do the jobs. Afghanistan War was another one, where the Canberra had to do the job which the Americans couldn't do. And those are the sort of things. So I wasn't too worried about it, and I was sent off to Bassingbourne, which was the operational conversion unit, just inside Cambridgeshire. And there we are, we're going to be paired up. And they said, right, we're going to tame you, young man. You're a bit headstrong. So I thought, oh, really? And how are you going to do this? They gave me a flight sergeant navigator who had wartime experience and everything else. And dear old Ken, he looked after me. Well, we got on well. He was a quiet guy, but, I was being looked after in the nicest possible way. And it was good. And we whizzed through that course. It should have been 3 months long. We did it in 2. And I was then on to an operational squadron within 2 years of joining the Air Force. Wow. Now, you compare that with what goes on today. Yeah. It's on a really operational aeroplane, and it was quite astonishing.
What was the role of the Canberra as a bomber during the Cold War?
It was a light bomber. We were using World War II weapons, 1,000-pound bombs. That's all we were armed with. Very, very primitive navigation aids, and G and GH were our main 2 radar navigation aids, and those are the 2 things that we relied on. Right. We hadn't got anything else much in the air, other than we could really climb to a big altitude and outclimb any fighter that was around in those days. And some of the exercises We did, with against Fighter Command, where we would go out in strength a whole load of Canberras and then come in from the east as if that's where the enemy was coming from. And we watched the fighters come up, especially on these daytime exercises. You could watch the fighters come up and said, "Can't you get any higher, chaps?" In the end, they caught on and they said, "No, you guys have been flying far too high. You're now restricted about 35,000 feet."
It's not fair.
Not unfair.
And what was the maximum altitude of the Canberra?
I discovered it later on when we ferried out to Australia. We used to do what was called a cruise climb, because in those days, no other aircraft was ever going to fly at our level. And we used to start about 40,000 feet and just set the power and the speed and let the aeroplane climb as it burned fuel. And I got up to 57,000 feet.
Wow.
Well, yes, and it is wow, because you've got a problem there, Ian, where your stalling speed is reducing purely because you're flying the aeroplane. At the same time, your Mach number, which you mustn't exceed, are going to coincide, and you're in a real pinnacle there of a control either way. You would,
So you're just sort of teetering on the edge.
On the edge.
Yeah.
It was known as Coffin Corner. It was well known phenomena that that's what happened. You could tumble out of the sky unless you were very careful.
Yeah.
But that was my learn. On the altitude of the Canberra. That was our Canberra B6 as opposed to the B2s, which were on 44 Squadron, which I was on at the time. Yeah, that was it, really.
And that was based in the UK?
That was based in that. Yes, initially I went to 100 Squadron at Wittering, just off the A1. Then, because they were going to make that into a Bomber Command Development Unit, they said, okay, you better go up the road to Cottesmore and join 44 Squadron. And we did. And it was all happening at Cottesmore. Squadrons had been moved in from Coningsby. Our squadron had been moved in from Coningsby. I was met there by the squadron commander, me, a very junior pilot officer, wondering what was going on. And it was all, my God, this is what's this I'm in for? It was great, and I learnt a lot there at Cottesmore, and we flew quite a lot of times in some atrocious weather and things. I had the odd incident, but that was it with a Canberra, which in its infancy was still giving problems and teething problems. But they were resolved, and of course it was still a lovely aeroplane. We were allocated, once we got on the squadron, we allocated another navigator who was really the radar guy more than anything, but he was also the bomb aimer if necessary. When we were first teed up at the operational conversion unit at Bassingbourne, my navigator, Ken, the flight sergeant, and we really were rushed around. There was one day in particular where we dropped 32 practice bombs individually around. It was a day and night exercise. We were armed with 16 bombs, go off and drop them. We did, reasonable results. It was all visual bombing, by the way. And then we went off and did the same thing at night with another 16 bombs. And they said, that's never been done before, 32 bombs in a day.
And how was your accuracy at night?
Well, not bad, actually, because the target was lit.
Oh, okay.
And it was a similar exercise to what you were doing during the day. So it was no problem at all,
Yeah. So what was the next posting?
Well, the next posting, we would then get round to the autumn of 55, about October. And this notice came out, crews required for special duties in Australia. And they were nominated as special duties. We hadn't a clue what it was about. Bachelors only to apply. Well, none of us were married in my crew. And my two bright navigators said, "You're taking us, buddy." And I thought, oh, well, how? Because I've only got 6 months of my 4-year commission left. Well, that can be fixed, surely. There's a bit of paper here which says you could apply for an extension. Oh, so I signed this off. And believe it or not, beginning of November, the posting at my 12-year direct commission came through, and within 24 hours, our posting on to this squadron that was going to go to Australia.
Wow. So you originally signed on for 3.
And I'd signed on for 4, and
Right.
yeah, and amazing, isn't it? What can be done when needs must.
It's very quick work for the RAF, I think. They obviously really wanted you out there. So,
Well, they were desperate for crews that were so single.
Yeah.
You know, bachelor boys, yeah.
And when were you aware of the nature of the missions you were
Right.
gonna be
Well, once we got down, we went back to Western Zoyland, where I'd done my meteor training, and so I was on familiar territory as far as going around the pubs are concerned, and I could guide the guys around to all the skittle alleys and everything else that were rife around Somerset in those days. And we, got to know, and of course, eventually we were herded together. Guys came from all over what was Bomber Command, who can make it or get crews together to come and do the job, all single guys. And we were herded together one day in the crew room and told what it was all about. Really, what the special duties are, going and flying through atom bomb and H-bomb clouds with our Canberras. Everybody was sort of, yes. That sounds a bit of an adventure, but at least it's going to be a big adventure and everything else. We weren't aware at that time that other people had already done this flying through clouds with the dear old Canberra B2, which I'd been used to. And, there were things that happened and that was never really passed on to us, or what it was all about. We were then going to be re-equipped. Well, the squadron was being reformed with Canberra B6 aircraft, which had considerably more power, a lot more fuel on board, because the wings were integral fuel tanks, which they weren't on the B2. So it had a lot more range and a lot more versatility all around. They were also fitted with special filters within the air conditioning system to take out a lot of the nasty stuff that could come in if we're going through these clouds. So as far as the aircraft frame was concerned, they made it as safe as it possible was in those days for the aircrew to survive and do those sort of things. When we were first told at Western Zoyland, before we even thought about ferrying out to Australia, and discussed what was going to happen to the aircraft, because we hadn't a clue, how contaminated they were going to get and everything. And they said, well, cripes, you're going to take a hell of a lot to get clean, and this needs to be sorted. How are we going to do it? And one bright spark says, well, we can fly them over to the Australian, the South Australia, and somebody will jump out and let them crash into the sea. And we said, yeah. And who's going to do that? Well, the pilot. You don't need navigators for that job. And that was some bright spark's idea of one way of disposing of the problem. Yeah. But it didn't come to that. We didn't seem to be too worried about it all. It was a big adventure for all of us. I was by far the youngest guy on the squadron by about 3 years or something like that, but yeah.
And were you given an option to decline when they told you the nature?
I don't think it came into it. My guys said, we're going, and I thought that's...
I've got sun, sea, sand... And,
that's it. It was... We were in that era where flying, everybody wanted to fly. Yeah. The enthusiasm for flying was still there. And you have the opportunity, let's do it. What a minute.
Yeah, and you think you're invincible at that age.
Of course you do.
As well, in this sexy aircraft you're flying around.
This lovely aeroplane.
Yeah.
It was Mrs. Queen has supplied for me, and thank you. And I'm enjoying flying it. It really was good.
And how did you get down there? Did you fly the aircraft down there in stages, or were you...
Oh, yes. We've got 10... or 11 crews on it, who all had to be, most of them had come off from flying the B2, none of them from the B6, which was not a great deal difference to it. It handled very similarly, except you were aware of more power, especially at the lighter weights. And we settled down, getting familiar with that, started doing exercises where we'd have even more limited navigation aids, using signal lights for a runway at night, because we didn't know where in the outback of Australia we'd be landing, and so we, made sure you always landed on the right-hand side of the lights. It would have been embarrassing. The other side was a load of a field or something, and that we did things like that, and got really familiar with the aeroplane. Then the first part of the squadron, all bar 2 crews, went off to Australia straight away to do the Montebello exercise there, which was part of Mosaic, as we know now. And they all went off and did the 2 bombs up on the northeast coast of Australia. We were left behind to receive 3 more brand new aeroplanes, delightful ones. And the one I got my hands on, nobody else flew it for 3 months. Nobody allowed. That's my aeroplane. Really positioned it. Really was. Don't you dare touch it, anybody. And then it came to beginning of July, 56, where we go off to Australia, and we set off to Australia. An interesting exercise going to Australia there. I did 1 stage a day, so it was very leisurely flying, because we flew straight out from Western Zoyland down to a place called Idris, Tripoli, in Libya. A night stop there. And that was the start of an exercise, because we met up with the Hastings crew, who also doing the same route as us to Australia. We said, oh, that's strange, but never mind. And they were using the same staging post as we were. So anyway, we said, oh, well, have a beer, and we had a beer and everything else, and they went to bed because they were getting up early to go off to Habania, which was the next stop in Iraq. And off they went, and trundle, left aeroplanes sitting on the ground there, all still covered up. The 3rd aeroplane was being flown by a wing commander from RAF Pembroke, and his crew. But anyway, the 3 of us were there, unwrapped them. They were already refueled, ready to go, climbed up, went trundling off, very high level, thank you very much, looking down for this Hastings that was obviously trundling along. But we know we'd get to Habania and land, and then put them away to bed for the night, covers on them and everything else. And eventually, we'd go straight to the bar, and the Hastings crew would land and say, those 3 aeroplanes were Idris when we departed, and you bloody well got here and you've been to the beer before we have. And that's how it went on, because we went on from there to Karachi. The Karachi was a bit of a nasty one, and we hit some really nasty weather going into Karachi. And I got a cracked navigation light cover, and fortunately the staging post had some spares and things, so they were able to fix my aircraft straight away. But we couldn't land at Moripur, which we were supposed to land, which was the RAF base. Had to land at the Karachi International because of flooding of the runways and everything else. It really was horrendous. And a terrible journey into to Moripur, where we were obviously going to be lodged, around the place called Fish Corner, where it was 1 million inhabitants in the most ghastly conditions. Don't you dare break down, coach. Awful, it really was. Anyway, we went on from there to Ceylon, to what was Negombo in those days, and Ceylon in those days. Another good night stop. And then the next one was straight on to Changi, Singapore, what is the big airfield now. But that was Changi, RAF Changi in those days. And went there, we had a couple of 3 nights there. Because we needed all the rest for the hard work we've done going flying down.
Absolutely.
And that was it. Sort of were there. The next was quite a long flog down to Darwin, and that was a longish leg. It took well over 4 hours, 4.5 hours, 5 hours. Landed at Darwin, very pleasant and everything else, and I landed mine. We parked the aeroplane. And then this wing commander who was flying our spare aircraft came up and says, I'm taking your aeroplane on from here. No, but you can't. I'm the only one that flies it. He said, no, I'm taking it. This one's broken. and he'd managed to break it somehow, and it was some. I'm not sure exactly what was unserviceable about it, but it wasn't flyable. And anyway, so I was left stuck with this heap up in Darwin for about another 6 days before we could then move off down to Pearce Field, just north of Perth in Western Australia. And that was it. We eventually got there and helped out on what it was all about. And that was good. We got there on a good trip, and we were well received. Back into the squadron proper. And we enjoyed that. Yeah.
And how were you briefed in terms of what you had to do, and what were you told to expect? What were you told to expect when you were flying these missions into the mushroom cloud?
We weren't given a great deal because we weren't sure on these bombs. The smaller ones they done at Montebello's, they were quite they weren't very big ones at all. And then they were moving on to 4 tests at a place called Maralinga. We'd moved across to Edinburgh Field, South Australia, from Adelaide. Anyway, we landed there, but then Maralinga was another hour's flight up the road, so we transit backwards and forwards to it all. Edinburgh Field had been built in the early 50s for really a backup for Woomera, and supplying Woomera with all the heavy duty stuff which they couldn't get into Woomera, Woomera. And Maralinga was, and then adjunct for it, that was brand new strip as well, and quite a lengthy one, because they'd built it to take V-Force aircraft if necessary.
Right.
And didn't know that. We weren't quite sure what it was going on. The first 1 or 2 went off. Obviously the boss did the first penetration, came back and said, well, you don't go straight into it. It is rising up, that's for sure, because then you're going to hit some current, and you don't want to know about those. So when advised from the ground, okay, you're clear to go in and collect samples at this stage, that's when we used to do the penetration. That's the best part we got. And it wasn't a great drama. I spent, when I did mine, I think about 12 and a half minutes in the cloud. In the end, they considered, yes, you've probably had enough radiation for you now. Come home, young man.
Yeah.
And of course, coming home, we landed in, obviously, a very contaminated aeroplane and taxied to a special part. The ground crew came out all wrapped up in their garb.
And you're just in regular flying suits?
Regular flying suits, but using 100% oxygen the whole time. And that was the big thing as well. Made sure that we were breathing pure oxygen. So that was the safe part, so we didn't inhale anything. With a mask covering mouth and nose, it was okay. Then we sort of, as I say, landed, and the boys, the ground crew came in, opened the door for us, and masked all the surrounds to the door with sealing paper, so that we could dive out. And I wanted to turn, I let the 2 navigators go first, made sure the ejection seats were made safe before they did, and I left the wheel brakes off because the guys were going to tow the aeroplane away to the far side of the airfield so it could cool off, so that it then could be worked on. But that was going to take a week just to sit there and cool, as they said, from the radiation that was on it. Yes. Yeah.
And how were they gathering data on the radiation? Were there sensors on the wings?
Yeah. No, what we had was special. What were they? Covers, metal over the nose of the tip tanks. We always flew with the tip tanks on because we needed the extra range, and in those was an actuator which had an opening in the front of this cover, which had the same shape, obviously, as the tip tanks. And then when we were in the thing, then the navigators, one of the navigators operated the switches, and the 2 vents opened, and all the stuff was sucked into filter papers there for them to do. Yeah, as simple as that.
Yeah. Was it just like flying through a regular cloud? really, at that
Not
point?
well. No, well, some clouds can be irregular. Some can
Well,
be.
yeah. What is a regular cloud? I guess is the question there.
Yeah, because the lot I did going into Karachi was
Yes.
that we didn't want to go through again. No, it was no problem at all. No, you were obviously on instruments because you've got to see where what you're doing, but there was no problem at all. No.
And was there anything attached to your flight uniform to detect radiation?
We had got little badges, but they weren't. I'm not sure they were issued to us on that first exercise. I'm not sure at all. Don't think we were. It's when they started going, and we moved on to the next lot. They started getting a bit more excited about how the dose rate was going to happen to us.
Was that because the weapon that they were moving on to bigger detonations?
Well, these we were doing at Maralinga on the first lot, to finish off Mosaic, were really triggers for the H-bomb.
Right.
Yeah, these were pure A-bomb.
So they
type.
were kiloton rather than megaton.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the megaton one was 10 times as powerful as the triggers that we were playing around with down in Maralinga. Yeah. That was as easy as that. And that was all job done until, then we had the next phase, what we were going to do. They hadn't got anything for us to do for 6 months after we'd done this exercise. What are you going to do with us? And they said, well, why don't you go home for Christmas? All the way back to England. So we said, oh, and how? And they said, SS Strathnaver is leaving Adelaide docks in a couple of 3 days' time. Pack your bags and get on board. So there was 18 of us aircrew and 40 ground crew got on board this and had a delightful trip back. Thank you very much. The Suez War was on at the time, so we couldn't go through the Suez, so we went through, after leaving... So
you went the scenic route, right?
Oh, yeah. After leaving Adelaide, we went to Fremantle, then straight across the Indian Ocean to Durban. And we had 2 or 3 days in Durban, sightseeing and things, lovely. Then around the corner to Cape Town, thank you very much, up to the top of Table Mountain and things, and then back on board, and away we went again. I think it was Tenerife we called out on the way there. One of the Canary Islands anyway. And then on to Tilbury, where we disembarked, and it took all of a month to do this trip.
Wow.
And they said, when we got off, and the normal officer in charge of disembarking passengers, and said, right, you're all on 6 weeks leave. So we said, oh, thanks very much. And sent us off home for 6 weeks. And
so because of your knowledge or expertise of flying through atom bomb clouds, you were then brought back in 6 months' time?
What happened then, after Christmas and into the new year, they said, right, you better go back to Australia now. We got nothing for you to do here. Your aircraft are out in Australia. You better go and get refamiliarised on the flying side with those and run them in before then you go onto Christmas Island. And that was a good thing. We went back out to Australia in Qantas Super Constellation, which seemed to stop everywhere compared with how we'd done it with our Canberras. There was about 3 stops to our 1. So yes, we went out there. We had 2 or 3 nights in Singapore where we stayed in Raffles Hotel, which
Very
enhanced our business things. And then it was carried on and into Sydney, and we went by Viscount down to Adelaide. Yeah. But that was it. But it was all of a sudden we worked it out. At the SS Strathnaver, and the crew had looked after us remarkably well on the ship going out. And they said, they suddenly realised they got a bunch of officers here who could, enjoy themselves. So we were invited immediately up onto the deck, the main deck where they operate, or the operations are, to see what the ship was all about and operating. We were invited, and they said, right, be here again midday tomorrow, pilots and navigators. we've got a job for you lot to do. So we all trooped up there on the first available day, and they said, right, pilots, you're going to check the steering gear of the ship. So we said, well, that sounds exciting. So we each had to go and turn in the handle, and it was normally on autopilot, and that was it. And the navigators, you've got to take the sunshots to find out where we are. So they had a job to do as well. And of course, theirs was important, and they had exactly logged the distance, because that distance was used as the raffle for the passenger who got the nearest distance on the day of going across. So they had to be very accurate on that one. But that was enjoyable. But going back and on the story, when we got to Sydney, we said, I wonder whether the Strathnaver is back. And sure enough, it was in Sydney. We were, no, we'll leave it till it gets to Adelaide, and then we'll go and invade them. And we did. A rotten lot that we were, yeah.
And were you flying from Australia to Christmas Island?
That was a long haul. We went up to Amberley, which is just west of Brisbane. And then Brisbane to Nadi in Fiji. And then a really long haul of 2,000 miles over shark-infested sea, over the equator and the international dateline, all on one trip. And it was 2,000 miles with no navigation aids other than the two navigators working their butts off on sun position lines with the periscopic sextant, which we had put in had been fitted to the B6s, the new aeroplanes that we had. They had fitted radio compasses for us, but they ran out after 100 miles, they ran out and were useless, absolutely useless. At Christmas Island, they had a DF situation where they could call steers and everything else, so that could accurately get us to the island, and that worked. But it was a long haul in pretty cold conditions at that high altitude.
Because I guess if you miss it, there's nothing else there.
Bye-bye, yes.
Wow. And so you were actually based on Christmas Island. That was the airbase.
The target for the Valiants on the bomb aiming place was Malden Island, which is 400 miles to the south, or just west of south. And that was there and set up as the target, with a whole load of trucks and things on there, just to see what damage that could be done with all the blasts and things. Yeah, we were all accommodated in tents and things, and getting used to life on Christmas Island before we got going.
I hear the crabs are a bit aggressive on that.
The land crabs particularly. We shared tents between us, and but the thing to do was to dig a trench round big enough so the crabs couldn't get through it.
Right. And you'd wake up in the morning and there'd be all these crabs in
the trench, but not getting at us. One or two people did have nasty experiences with them, and the hermit crabs were okay, but it was the land crabs that weren't. Yeah.
Right.
And the mess life, well, the army cooks did a marvellous job. Really helped out there. Provisions were, gin was 2D.
Wow. Well, 2 old pence.
So old pence.
God, you wouldn't even find a coin for that nowadays, I don't think.
No. Gosh. And but the expensive bit was the gin. It was the tonic. a small bottle of tonics that was 6D.
Right. Wow. And with these larger weapons, were you having to fly at a higher altitude for these?
No. My job was a peculiar one. They needed somebody to be a VHF relay, in between the target area and the base operations at base on Christmas Island, because the VHF range was not sufficient with the equipment from those days. But they could do it with an aeroplane orbited halfway between the two. Right. And the Valiant was virtually on the same thing, but he was on an orbit slightly higher than us. I would be the first aircraft off on this exercise, on this, what happened on this trip. We were going off there and positioned ourselves in what we called a racetrack pattern, set up. And then the Valiant would come off almost immediately. It took off apparently almost immediately afterwards. I always remember Wing Commander Hubbard, who was flying it, seeing me in the mess afterwards, he said, "Christ, I thought you were never going to get airborne," he told me. I said, "Well, I had got an aeroplane full of fuel. The temperature was up well into the 30s, and the humidity was pretty high. The poor old aeroplane was struggling to get airborne as it was, and we could have been shark and fodder if an engine had failed. But there we are." So, yes, that's why we're doing that. He says, "Cool." We were okay. We had a fairly light Valiant to go and do the job. And that's what we did. And we did that orbit. And when we were on heard the countdown and it was going to be exploded at 8,000 feet, the weapon. Obviously, we saw a flash, but by that time we were going well away from 200 miles.
And did you have to wear protective goggles or anything?
No, we were 200 miles away from it. Right. Because it was being aimed at the island, and we were 200 miles well clear, so we were considering it, and we were in safe territory. As soon as we'd done that, and I'd been cleared from my duties that the Valiant was on its way back, that my sniffer mates were climbing up to high altitude to get in through it, the two aeroplanes. But job then was to go and survey the island immediately to see what superficial damage or serious damage had been done to Malden Island. And we all, from what we could see, was skating over it, not a great deal. And fuel by that time was getting a little bit tight. So
what sort of altitude were you over the island?
Over the island, we let down to low level, 1,000 feet.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you were cameras running to, or was it just a visual observation?
Visual observation,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's all we had. Well,
the radiation levels must have been quite high.
Well, they were going up.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything was going up.
Right.
As they do in the bombs. And from the place it detonates, it doesn't go down. Yeah. It rises, obviously. Yeah. And that's what was going. They did, as I understood it.
Yeah, I'm no scientist, so I don't know what's left on. I would imagine there's got to be some radiation still left on the at ground level.
Well, it was main blast effect.
Yeah.
Was what they were keen to see, and it did. It set the odd thing on fire. You could see the flames and looking around. That was it. So we did an orbit round and got away. I had sitting on my jump seat on the Canberra who was a wing commander Denning in those days, who had done the original one on Totem at Emu Field about 3 years beforehand. And he seemed a bit cut out that he couldn't fly the aeroplane himself, but no.
My plane.
My plane. Yes. But yes, and it was quite a long trip. Yes. Yeah.
And how many of those did you?
I did. That was the first. There were 3 grapples. Three made up the grapple. The second one I missed out on completely, and the third one I did exactly the same act again. So I never really got into penetrating the H-bomb clouds. One of the reasons was that with my nose, the shape of my nose, we couldn't get a proper seal for the oxygen and everything else. We borrowed American equipment as well to try and get a seal. And they said, "Okay, we'll give you a safe job." And I got the safer job of doing the relay.
Well, that was possibly a bonus. Lucky break for you there. Yeah.
So, yes, that was it. But in between, the lull in between, I had 2 trips to Honolulu and back. VIP passengers who rated a Canberra to take them up to Honolulu and possibly wait 2 or 3 days and then come back. And I did that twice, and that was very pleasant to go in the officers' mess or whatever they like to call the officers' club. Yeah. Used to stay in there, and I lived quite well on the American fodder.
I think I was talking to somebody about couldn't believe the steaks.
Yeah, that's right.
that were available, and it was the first time he'd seen a serviette as well. I wasn't sure what to do.
Yeah, well, from the food, or the plain food we had on Christmas Island, this was really making up for it. And we sort of tucked in to sort of set ourselves up in a store.
Was this Hickam Field?
Hickam Field, yeah.
Okay.
And that was, the American controllers suddenly realised it got a load of Brits who didn't really speak their language, but no, it all worked rather well, and we didn't have any incidents. I understand later on there were 1 or 2 incidents going up there. people getting lost and that. But no, bless my navigators, they did the job properly.
Yeah.
And of course, you had a certain amount of cover from outbound from Christmas Island. They could give you bearings and things, so you could correct it. And then going inbound, the Americans were starting to get some reasonable navigation radar, and they could pick you up and help you around. So it did help. Yeah, it made us feel a bit more confident.
and was Christmas Island your last missions with the atom bomb?
No. Oh no, oh no, they didn't let me go that long. No. I did one or two other trips. Like aeroplanes were going to go inevitably unserviceable, couldn't be fixed on Christmas Island, had to be got back somehow. And so in various states of serviceability, we were flying aeroplanes down to Fiji and to Nandi there. And a crew would come up, because we still got two or three spare crews left in Australia, would come up and take the aircraft back to Australia and get for it to be fixed. We used Canton Island, which is got quite a narrow strip, it really is, and around another lagoon in a similar way. But that cut down the distance to Fiji, that was for sure, and helped a bit on that one. And then we were there on that trip. Yes. From there, it was back to Christmas Island for the last bomb to really go off, and then get everything back to Australia. I got a touch of Asian flu there, which was a bit nasty in Fiji, but that was fixed by a doctor giving me some pills and things and put me back onto a Hastings aeroplane and took me back to Christmas Island. But there on board this Hastings, what was the cargo? Nothing but booze. Crates and crates of gin, whiskey, you name it. It was full.
Priority delivery.
A priority delivery to keep the troops happy. And but I was not feeling at all like any of it.
No.
Yeah. And then we did the last one as well. And that was it. And then we started ferrying all the aeroplanes back to our base at Edinburgh Field, ready for the next one, which was Antler, an exercise Antler. And that was in the autumn as well of 57 we got to now. There were going to be three more tests there on that. I forget which one I was allocated to in the end. I'm not so sure it wasn't the third. But we lived in the mess up at Maralinga airfield, and the life was good. A quick aside, do you mind another aside story here?
No, absolutely. We love a tangent.
We had a blooming good bunch of aircrew there. There was a bunch from the varsity aircraft as well, which I was helping to fly. And we had a poker school in the mess every night, after a meal. There we were all, because the mess was the only solid building at the airfield. We were in tents otherwise. And there it was, and playing poker one night. And then all of a sudden they shout, "Sputnik's going over!" And it was the first Sputnik going over. So we had to troop outside pretty good and see what this light go through the sky. And it was the first Sputnik. Wow. Wandered back in the mess, and blow me down, the pile of money was still there. Nobody had pinched it. And then I did my last trip as a sampler. Going through it. I'd been tracking the bombs before, but as a proper sampler and getting it all on board and tucking it away. And then got back, and we went back to Edinburgh Field. Now what's happening? And they said, we think you've done enough, and you better go home before you get any more radiation. And they weren't. Nobody had a clue how much total we'd already but the estimate from the medics was, well, you've probably done enough for all the flying that you've done, so and they sent me home from there. And that was an even better trip going back, because, as I say, we had 3 varsity aircraft out there searching for the abos and things, so make sure that they didn't drift into the site from the bombs going off. Oh, and there was one I must tell you about, was and they're going to set off a night one, and they did them from the towers, okay? and this night one was going to be set off from the tower, and some wise bloke said, they're enjoying themselves too much on the airfield. Get all that aircrew up here to come and observe this from 5 miles away. 5 miles away from an atom bomb? You've got to be joking. No. So they did, and they positioned us there. Gave us this briefing, back where we had to have our backs to where the ground zero was going to be. Cover your eyes up, closed, and everything else with your fingers. And to this day, Ian, I can still see the skeleton of my fingers through that flash, when that flash went off. Absolutely incredible. You wouldn't have believed it. And then we could watch the blast, because the low level of stratus had come in at the time, and you could watch the shock wave coming through that low level of stratus and hit us. Yeah.
And how strong was that from 5 miles?
Quite strong. One of my mates was standing on a mound, and he got blown off it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Picked himself up, dusted himself down. Yeah.
5 miles away, and presumably they've calculated that the fallout's going to go the other way.
Oh yeah, well, yeah. So, yeah, we were fairly safe anyway. Yeah. It's only a little toy, that was. It's
still 5 miles is very
well. It's pretty adjacent.
Very close.
Yeah.
Do you know what size that one was?
I haven't a clue. No, we weren't privy to anything like that. No.
So was that your last experience of?
Yeah. As I say, they said pack your bags. You're going home. And by that time, I was quite good pals with the varsity lot, and they were finished as well, and were going to fly the 3 aeroplanes back to the UK. So I said, well, I can be a co-pilot on that and go back there, nice and comfy, and give the captain a free. And we did this, and it took us 3 weeks. All the different places we stopped on the way back. It was quite hilarious. It really was. In the end, the man I was with, the captain I was with, we did leg and leg about. I was in the left. He said, "Come on, you know enough about flying aeroplanes. We'll convert you to the varsity on the way home." And he'd blow me down. He did, so I became qualified on the varsity.
So that was another one for the
logbook.
Wow.
Yeah. So really, that was it. And as far as that was concerned, I was concerned with our sister squadron, 542 Squadron, which was at Western Zoyland when we arrived there to form 76. 542 had Canberra B2s, but stripped down for a different purpose, overload tanks in the bomb bay and things like that. But they were doing high altitude sampling of the high altitude from the bombs that had been going off all around the world at this time.
Right. So like the French tests.
Yeah, French tests and things like that. And they were based in Gibraltar, based in Canada. There was virtually a permanent base down in Australia, near Melbourne. A couple of airplanes down there for that as well. So I was involved with that, and it was what they were hired, getting up to 47,000 feet with those dear old airplanes. You're doing the job again to take the samples, just sampling from it.
Because I seem to remember you saying that originally the plan was to just ditch the aircraft.
By resting the aeroplanes well away on the airfield until they cooled off from the radiation, and then they, properly dressed, could then work on the exterior there, but not the engines, because they were obviously going to be, as we call, radiation hot, right through, having sucked all the air in and pushed it out the back end.
There's further information such as photos and videos in our episode notes, which will show as a link in your podcast app. Now, this show wouldn't exist without our generous Patreons, so I want to thank one and all of them for their support. You can very easily become a Patreon by going to coldwarconversations.com/donate. And you can also join our Facebook group where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Thanks very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye. Thanks for listening right through to the end. I really appreciate it. And maybe check out our store and see if you can find the ideal gift for the Cold War enthusiast in your life. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/store. Thanks for listening.